It's October, the spookiest month of the year, and since I love all things creepy and chilling, I wanted to do a video on a more macabre location. I took a tour of Highgate Cemetery a couple of years ago with my partner, and I just adored the place. Now that might sound like a weird thing to say about a cemetery, but the place has such a unique atmosphere, and whilst I was admiring the magnificent Victorian and Gothic architecture now enveloped by nature, I was overcome with a peaceful albeit eerie calm. I remember it being a cold and sunny winter's day, and while wandering through the West Cemetery I found myself thinking of all the people buried here, now unaware of my presence. What kind of lives had they lived? What would they think and say if they could see the world now? Highgate certainly has no shortage of significant residents who had much to say before they died. Some of its more famous inhabitants include Karl Marx, the famed philosopher who founded Marxism, the poet Christina Rossetti, and author of A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy Douglas Adams, his grave being a personal favourite of mine, with its pot of pens and adornment of toy cars. A more morbid plot is that of Alexander Litvinenko, the former KGB agent who defected to Britain and was murdered by believed Russian agents who poisoned him with radioactive material. This is just a small selection of the many notable people interred at Highgate. The cemetery itself possesses around 53,000 graves and 170,000 burials between the West and East cemeteries. It's no wonder the English poet Sir John Betjeman described Highgate as a Victorian Valhalla. But how did this cemetery come to be? How did it fall into ruin and eventually be saved? During the early 19th century, London was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. The capital was experiencing an explosion of new factories and mills, and with it, new employment. As a result, millions of citizens began moving into the capital from rural areas. Between 1801 and 1841, London's population doubled from 1 million to 2 million. All of these extra citizens would create a major problem for London's already overflowing cemeteries. With the death rate reaching roughly 45,000 per year, the room for burials had become critically low. By the 1820s, church graveyards were overflowing with corpses. Graves were being dug at shallow depths and being reused within months of the original burial. This would lead to a public health disaster. There were regular outbreaks of cholera and typhoid, and London would suffer its first major cholera epidemic in 1831. Another major issue of the time was body snatching. Body snatchers, known as resurrection men, were taking advantage of the abundance of easily accessible bodies. These criminals would dig a shaft down to the head of the coffin, break it open and place a rope around the neck of the cadaver, which would then be pulled up and out of the ground. The bodies were sold to physicians and medical schools for dissection since, at the time, it was only legal for executed murderers to be used for this practice, thus creating a large demand for bodies. Many newspapers of the time reported on the foul state of churchyards and the plague of body snatching. It was obvious that London was crying out for more and better protected burial spaces. In response to the public outcry, in 1836 an Act of Parliament to build more cemeteries to the north, south and east of London was declared. This led to the establishment of the London Cemetery Company, which was founded by the renowned architect and entrepreneur Stephen Geary. It was decided that a beautifully designed garden cemetery would be best for attracting patrons, perhaps inspired by the successful Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which had opened in 1804. 7 large modern cemeteries, now known as the Magnificent Seven, were planned and built, including Highgate. Highgate was the third cemetery to be built, and on the 20th of May 1839, the West Cemetery was dedicated to St James by the Lord Bishop of London, the Right Reverend Charles James Blomfield. 15 acres were consecrated for use by the Church of England, and a further 2 acres were reserved for dissenters, that being Protestant Christians that had separated from the Church of England. The first burial would take place on the 26th of May 1839 and was that of Elizabeth Jackson. The cemetery would quickly flourish and become a popular site for burials. With its tall walls and cast iron gates, Highgate promised security and serenity. One advert from the time even claimed that an armed force of retired soldiers guarded the cemetery day and night. 212 burials took place within the first year of business, with the average age of the interred being just 33. This was sadly due to the fact that a quarter of these burials were under 5. In order to make Highgate as attractive as possible, the London Cemetery Company hired the renowned nurseryman David Ramsay to work with Geary as a landscape architect. The ingenuity of their design was commented upon as early as 1838, and visitors would come from all over London to admire the beautifully manicured grounds. Some of Highgate's more notable pieces of architecture includes the two Gothic chapels sitting either side of the West Cemetery's large gateway, which is secured with massive cast iron gates. The chapel on the left is for Anglicans and the one on the right for dissenters. Through this gateway is a large courtyard where Victorian coaches could turn around, and the colonnade, which is a structure made up of 15 stone arches and has a staircase in its centre that leads up to the West Cemetery. Perhaps the most striking feature of the West Cemetery is of course the Egyptian Avenue, a stone archway flanked by lotus columns and obelisks, thought to have been inspired by stories of Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt and Egyptian artefacts brought back to the British Museum in the 19th century. The avenue was originally a tunnel, however the roof is now missing. The avenue leads to the Circle of Lebanon, a circle of 20 chambers with cast iron doors. At the centre of the circle is a centuries-old cedar tree that has been present since the original design of the cemetery was first devised. Passing out of the circle, there are many mausolea, including the Grand Beer Mausoleum, which holds the remains of Julius Beer and his family. Beer, who was originally from Frankfurt, made his fortune on the London Stock Exchange and was proprietor of the Observer newspaper. Before his death, he purchased a plot at Highgate for £800 and had his mausoleum constructed on the site, costing a further £5,000. Taking inflation into account, this would have been around £3 million in today's money. The Beer Mausoleum is the biggest and most elaborate memorial in the cemetery and possibly the largest private memorial in all of London. It was designed by John Aldridge Scott and was based on the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It includes a marble statue of Beer's young daughter, who died of scarlet fever at the age of 8, being carried up to heaven, and the dome ceiling features a golden mosaic. At the highest point of the West Cemetery, overlooking the Circle of Lebanon, sits the terrace catacombs. These catacombs were constructed in 1838 and contain 55 numbered bays, each possessing 15 niches into which coffins are inserted and sealed with a slab that either has a glass viewing panel or inscription. There are also a number of war graves spread between the West and East cemeteries. 257 are from the First World War and 59 from the Second. There is also a cross of sacrifice and a wall of remembrance, inscribed with the names of soldiers who fell in battle. These graves are maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. With the complete ban of burials in central London in 1852, the demand for burial space only grew, and so Highgate would be expanded in 1854 with the purchase of 19 acres of land on the other side of Swains Lane, which would become the East Cemetery. The location of the East Cemetery posed a problem, however, as, at the time, there was no way of respectfully transferring coffins from the chapels across Swains Lane. Victorian engineers found a solution in 1855 when an underground tunnel was dug from the chapels to the East Cemetery. Coffins were lowered into this tunnel silently through the use of a hydraulic lift and transported discreetly across. The East Cemetery would be opened in 1860. One of the largest ever funerals to take place at Highgate was that of Thomas Sayers in 1865. Sayers was an immensely popular Victorian bare-knuckle boxer, and his funeral attracted over 10,000 mourners. His most faithful companion, a bull mastiff by the name of Lion, was his chief mourner, and rode on an open-top individual carriage behind his master's coffin. A stone sculpture of the dog still guards Sayers' chest tomb in the West Cemetery. One of the most controversial events to take place at Highgate would occur in 1907, and was the exhumation of Thomas Druce. This is a very strange story, and it captivated the Victorian public for decades, and I find it quite fascinating, so I'll give a brief summary. Thomas Druce was a furniture dealer from London who died in 1864, and was buried in Highgate's West Cemetery. He had been married twice and fathered 6 children with his second wife, Annie Druce. One of Annie's sons, Walter Druce, died in 1880 and left behind a widow, Anna Maria Druce, who would go on to make some extraordinary claims about her father-in-law. Anna claimed that Thomas Druce was not who he said he was, that Thomas Druce was merely an alias, and that her father-in-law had in fact been the late 5th Duke of Portland. She further claimed that Druce's coffin contained only lead weights, and that the Duke had dug a tunnel between his London home and Druce's furniture shop in order to reach it without being seen. The Duke was accused of faking his death as Thomas Druce so he could return to his old life until he died in 1879. There was some evidence to support Anna's claims. The Duke of Portland was known for being eccentric and reclusive, rarely being seen in public, and he had even dug extensive tunnels beneath his home in Nottinghamshire. Because of this, Anna tried to claim her son was the rightful heir of the Duke's estate and title. Anna would chase her claims through the courts for years, but was eventually declared insane and sent to an asylum. One of Druce's grandsons from his first marriage would continue to fight the case together with a cousin until eventually Herbert Druce, Thomas Druce's eldest son, consented to the exhumation of his remains. With a police guard at the gates, the coffin of Thomas Druce was exhumed in 1907. The coffin didn't contain any lead weights, but it did contain a body that was still identifiable as Thomas Druce. The case soon collapsed after this, however the story continued to generate much debate and interest for years afterwards. Highgate would continue to be a most sought after place of burials, however in 1939 Britain would enter the Second World War. Come 1940, London would suffer extensive bombing campaigns from the Luftwaffe. Known as the Blitz, the capital was decimated, and with all resources and manpower diverted to wartime efforts, the grounds of Highgate would see little maintenance. Nature began to reclaim the once pristine headstones and tombs. Roots cracked stone and undergrowth swarmed large areas. Perhaps due to the decaying state of the once pristine burial place, it was after the war and during the 60s and 70s that stories and myths of occult and supernatural occurrences began to afford Highgate a negative reputation for being haunted. The most famous of these stories is of course the Highgate vampire, a supposed supernatural creature that is said to disappear and reappear throughout the cemetery, stalking visitors and watching them menacingly from afar. Despite no evidence of the creature's existence, the public became enamoured with the stories of the vampire, and fear of the creature reached its peak in 1970 when, on the evening of Friday the 13th, a mob of amateur vampire hunters armed with stakes and other weapons actually overwhelmed police and broke into the cemetery to search the premises. These hunters did not find the vampire. However, a few months later the body of a woman was discovered, having been dragged from a nearby catacomb. She had been beheaded and was badly charred. The panic over the Highgate vampire is often blamed on media hype from the time and a testament of a man named Sean Manchester. Manchester, a self-proclaimed exorcist and vampire hunter, was one of the first people to make claims of a vampire stalking Highgate. The mob that invaded the cemetery in 1970 was thought to be drawn there by claims that Manchester would perform an exorcism that night to expel the vampire. Whilst hunting the vampire himself, he claims to have entered one of the catacombs which he was guided to by a psychic, and discovered a woman's coffin that had supposedly moved there from a different one. He was about to stake the woman's body through the chest, but was stopped by one of his companions and instead left garlic and incense within the vault. Another figure who helped to popularise the Highgate vampire was David Farrant. Farrant claimed to have sighted supernatural creatures within the cemetery, and entertained a rivalry with Manchester over who could successfully destroy the Highgate vampire. Farrant was arrested in 1970 by police, who discovered him patrolling the cemetery carrying a crucifix or wooden stake. Although no charges were brought against him, Farrant was arrested again, however, in 1974 for desecrating remains and vandalising memorials. He denied the charges and claimed the damage was caused by Satanists. Stories of mythical creatures haunting Highgate soon died down, although the vampire definitely had an impact on popular culture, and it's even said that the Hammer horror film Dracula AD 1972, starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, was inspired by the Highgate vampire. It was during the 1970s that Highgate was no longer deemed commercially profitable, and was completely abandoned to nature. Thankfully though, in 1975 the Friends of Highgate Cemetery was founded and took over the cemetery. The Friends is a charitable organisation that began restoring the site and continues to this day. The charity decided it was best to try and find a balance between nature and the cemetery by managing the woodland and wildlife rather than removing it. This has allowed the cemetery to flourish as a de facto nature reserve. Many species of birds and butterflies have been observed visiting, and urban foxes are a common sight. A population of hedgehogs has also been established, and bat and bird boxes were erected to further encourage wildlife. In 2012, a rare species of spider, the Metabonetti, was even discovered inhabiting the vaults of the Egyptian Avenue. Highgate Cemetery certainly has a rich and fascinating history. I barely had time to go over all of the interesting elements surrounding this captivating place. It comes as no surprise that so many of the successful, intellectual and influential people of the past and present continue to choose this site as their final resting place. I really can't understate how great the work of the Friends of Highgate Cemetery is. They have expertly restored the site and continue to maintain it for the public to enjoy. The beauty of the managed but still very much wild grounds and woodland, and the wildlife they encourage, rivals that of the magnificent man-made architecture. Well, that's about all I had to say. Thanks for watching. I hope you're having a good October, and yeah, bye.